Not only Swarthmore.
All right, it's exciting to just see the range of perspectives that people will bring to bear on this conversation. All right, and my last question is, can we get a show of hands for anybody who has either, and you can define this for yourself, either professional expertise or some sort of civic responsibility or civic oversight around this issue? Excellent. Thank you all for being here. Because what's exciting is that this is an issue at which many of our perspectives as individual residents intersect with policies that all of you can weigh in on and take action on. So it's really exciting to have a mix of perspectives in the room. So let me just frame our conversation before we get started. For those of us who have lived here, we can see that Swarthmore is changing. There are lots of exciting new opportunities and plans that are bringing people into town and raising the profile of our town, which is very exciting. But we also know that people may be left out, whether it's through the consequences of historical exclusion or more recently, just the economic challenges of the pandemic. And we know that housing is a central factor in this. Housing costs are rising here as they are throughout the country. But we can be proactive in looking for local solutions to support, as our zoning code says, a mix of people from all economic, social, and educational backgrounds and of all ages, races, and creeds. So to that end, thanks to Borough Council for authorizing the task force earlier this year. And our goal is to recommend strategies to Borough Council for preserving and expanding reasonably priced housing. So those of us who are on the task force have spent the last few months learning a lot about the issue, and we want all of you to learn with us. And so we are so excited to have 4 experts whose perspectives we've been reading about to bring you together today to think about some of the intersections between the expertise that you bring to the issue, as well as joining or leading really all of us in a conversation to think about how these very wide-ranging issues might affect us here in Swarthmore and what we can do about it. So thank you all for joining us. So I'm going to start by introducing each of you and asking you to reflect on perhaps the most critical question that we think about when we talk about affordability. And that is, what does affordability mean to you when it comes to housing? Because there are many, as we've learned, there are many different ways to think about affordability. So our first speaker, actually I'll just go introduce you down the line. A little bit of housekeeping here is that we are each going to try to use the mic because we are recording this, as well as to make sure that everybody in the room can hear. So we'll be doing a lot of passing the mic around, so thank you for your patience. As well as when we get to the audience Q&A, we will ask you to step up front and use the mic as well. So let me introduce all of you before we pass the mic along to have you answer that first question. So starting to my left here, Gyourko is a professor of real estate finance and business economics and public policy at the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. And fortunately for us, he is also a resident of Swarthmore. And he's the co-author of a book that's been really influential in shaping our thinking called Rethinking Federal Housing Policy, How to Make Housing Plentiful and Affordable. Thank you, Joe. Next is Patricia Bell, who is here from the Housing Equality Center of Pennsylvania, where she is responsible for consumer outreach and education and building relationships with consumer-serving entities to better meet the fair housing needs of their constituents. She's also worked in fair housing and community support organizations in Nashville, Tennessee, Richmond, Virginia, and Washington, D.C. So she brings a lot of perspectives from other areas to her work here. Then moving along, Rebecca Ross is the principal planner at the Delaware County Planning Department. And in September of 2020, the department released its housing plan for Delaware County 2035, which is the comprehensive plan for Delaware County and provides a policy framework for land use decisions in the county. So it's a great kind of roadmap for where our region is headed. And last but not least, Wright is the former development director for Strong Towns, an organization that advocates for cities of all sizes to be safe, livable, and inviting, and particularly works to elevate the role of local government And until recently, he was the executive director of Kennett Collaborative, where he put these ideas into practice to help Kennett Square thrive through placemaking events and community development initiatives, a lot of which resonates with some of the work that we're trying to do here. So we're looking forward to learning from Beau's work. So let me go back to this first question of what does affordability mean to you when it comes to housing? I'm gonna ask Joe to weigh in first.
I'm gonna see if that will hold, and presumably you can hear me, and then we'll pass it to you. So first, thanks for inviting me. It's a topic I research and think about in general and teach on at Wharton. But given the practical nature of the charge from the Borough Council, I'm not so sure how useful I'm going to be. Academics tend not to be all that real world, even Wharton ones. So my research and the way I think about this and how I define affordability really is from an airplane cruise altitude, 30,000 square feet. It's not from down at the street level. Fortunately, 3/4 of the panel is going to be at the street level. Now, hopefully, some of the lessons I've learned from what the market and the more aggregate level teaches us will be useful. But if they're not, that's all I have. Anyway, okay. So what does affordability mean to me? It really means two things. I think there are two big affordability issues in America. One is how to house the poor. The poor have low incomes, and relative to the high costs of even incredibly efficiently produced housing in almost all American markets, cheap ones, expensive ones, poor people can't afford it. The problem there is not the property market. It's not real estate developers. It's the low incomes. This is just an expensive, housing's an expensive, durable good. I will not nerd out too much, but in the cheapest market in America, under a typical zoning code, it costs $130 to $140 a foot to produce a foot of decent quality housing. That's not really nice stuff with granite in the kitchen and all that good stuff. You know, it's basic siding, no basement. So if you're a family of three on $30,000, which is really low income, but above the federal poverty guidelines, you can't afford that house. This housing, it's 130, 100. If you do the math, you need at least 1,000 square feet. Multiply 130, 140 times 1,000. I got a $140,000 house. The problem there is the private market will not build for that family. Why? Because the return on the cost, which including a profit margin for the developer, is going to be something like 130, 140K, is so low they won't do it. Right? Their developers are not charities, they're business people. They have to make a reasonable rate of return. The return's too low. Therefore, you need the government for that population. You need subsidies in some way, and they gotta be big. And the basic issue is incomes are too low relative to the cost of this expensive, durable good called a housing unit. Okay? I will have nothing more to say about that because there's nothing in economics I can offer to solve that problem. It's a resource problem. Societies will decide how we're going to allocate resources, but the market's not going to do it. Neither is the borough of Swarthmore or any individual city. It's way too expensive. Second thing is there's a non-poor affordability problem, and that one's growing. It has always been there. By always been there, it's been there for the last 30, 40 years in our expensive coastal markets. Middle-class households cannot afford the median house in the Bay Area, the New York City metropolitan area, the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area, the Boston, and then go down from Seattle, I already said San Francisco, LA, and San Diego. Typical housing is out of reach of a middle-class household, the typical household earner in those markets. And the reasons is really quite clear. There's too little housing being built to satisfy the demand. So it's systematically undersupplied. And the numbers are as follows. In all the big coastal markets I talked about, they never permit that is, give housing permits to build more than 1% of the total stock in the metro area, not in any given jurisdiction like Swarthmore, in any given year. 1 to 2% would be a huge production boom in those markets. In contrast, in the Sun Belt, in Phoenix, they will permit 5 to 6% a year at the height of booms. They will literally grow the metropolitan area by 1/20th in a single year. Okay? Housing's relatively cheap there. Okay? Now, what's changed in the last 5 to 7 years and has been really amplified by COVID is the middle class affordability problem has spread off the expensive coastal markets into other markets, including this one to some extent. We are by no means in as bad a situation as a lot of markets, but it's gotten tougher here, and I suspect that's one of the reasons for the task force. What's the problem? The problem in econ speak is what economists call a market failure. In the United States, it's local control of housing development. It's local. If you go to Great Britain, you get off the airplane at Heathrow, take a cab into London, those green zones, they're designed and defined and legislated by Parliament. Westminster, in the national parliament in London, sets those things. The borough council does here. By the way, you go to Springfield, it's their council. You go to some other, it's theirs. So it's local control. And the way it often works is, it will make good sense to you, guess what? The mayor needs to be elected. So the mayor's probably going to cater to our interests, the residents. And it turns out, the equilibrium turns out to be, we've got our own, nobody else should get in. That's kind of what explains what's done. I've grossly oversimplified, but it's local control, and there's no political failure. The councils and mayors of these places are representing their residents as, you'd expect them to, but they don't have to take, the current residents don't have to take into account the benefits that newcomers who don't live here and therefore do not vote in our elections, that they would get from entering our borough, our market, and the like. So you end up with too little housing. So the last thing I'll say before I pass the baton is, as I think about what is affordability, for me it's how do we get to a better place? And one of the ways I think we get to a better place is to understand there are negative effects of any new development. Okay? The immediate one is there's pollution and noise around the development site. The longer run ones, which I think the mayors and councils are responding to, is dense development, which I'll come to in just, that'll be my final point. Dense development causes congestion. It causes congestion on the roads, and it causes congestion in the schools. And people care about both of those things. So to get around this sort of bias against new development that I think comes naturally from the American system of local control, we're going to have to come up with a way to compensate communities for the negative effects of any development, right? There are many benefits from having new neighbors and growth and the like, but there are real costs, and those costs are salient to voters, and they tell the local council and the like. So one of the things I think we need to do is just be cognizant that there are costs and we need to address them. The other thing I think the community, this will be my practical, my perhaps only practical comment, is density in a community like this. We should experiment with different types of density. We'll provide variety, and density will allow smaller housing units. Smaller housing units tend to be more affordable. Remember, it costs a certain amount per square feet. If you don't have as many square feet, you're not gonna have to pay as much for it, either in rent or if you own it. So that would be my other advice, is density is where built out communities like ours, which is a lot of America, should think about these days. But density is going to cause political pushback, and it's real because the costs are real, and we just have to be upfront and figure out a way to address the costs. So with that, I will turn it over.
so much, Joe. Can you hear me? And I think I'm gonna kind of, I don't know if I'm gonna directly answer this question. I might kind of go about it in a roundabout way. I think there are program definitions about what is affordable. You know, a lot of people say it's about 30%. But when we're thinking about affordability, I think there needs to be a lot of consideration into the cost burden residents. And so I think a lot about residents that have subsidies, who, like, there's a lot of housing that is affordable to them, but there's a lot of housing providers that aren't going to accept the subsidies. And then I also think a lot about support systems. So someone can have similar income with no support, right, opposed to another person that has support, whether it's from family, friends, or whatever. And housing might be a little bit more affordable, right? Because a lot of times what we've seen at our organization and kind of the stories that we've heard a lot about, you know, people are able to pay for housing, but then, you know, a crisis occurs, whether it's a medical emergency or something, and then people are stuck having to decide what they're going to pay for. Am I gonna pay my rent, or am I going to, you know, make payments to this medical bill? Am I gonna pay my rent, or am I gonna pay for childcare, right? And so, and just thinking about affordability, I think a lot about what the residents' needs are and kind of the different things that can come up. And I also think a lot about housing costs. And so, when we talk about affordability, a lot of times we see at our organization, there are a lot of people that, again, have subsidies that are able to pay for housing in different areas, but because the stigma that exists with subsidy holders, they're not able. So even though that housing would be otherwise affordable to them, they're unable to kind of use that subsidy and pay for their housing because the housing provider refuses to accept that. So I'm going to be short with this question and kind of pass it off then too.
Okay, so I also, like Joe, I don't think I have as extensive and well thought out an answer as Joe. And if I did, it would probably be, there might be some wonky overlap as well, but I do have the, my simple and sort of literal take on this question of what does affordability mean is, as Patricia referenced, there is a general standard that spending about 30% of your household income on housing costs is generally considered to be the standard for affordability that is measured. For example, when we at the county are looking at sort of tracking the health of our communities and we are using census data, we're looking at the percentage of communities and the population within the county that is spending 30% or more of their household income on housing. And Joe again touched on a lot of really great information and more in-depth on trends and sort of this newly emerging concept of attainable housing as well, which is not always subsidized, but more entry level for first-time home buyers, or related to younger couples or retired people on a fixed income, or middle-class workers. So one thing that the planning community has kind of started looking at is maybe considering a definition of affordability as more of 45% of a household income when you incorporate transportation costs. And that shifts the balance and the conversation a little bit when looking at communities, because then these boom towns in the Sun Belt that are building housing at an incredible rate are negating the idea that also you're gonna have to drive everywhere, and that our East Coast towns, I mean, probably even with that standard, as Joe mentioned, that the costs are premium in certain areas, older Northeast areas like Philadelphia, that you do still have a strain on income, but it does balance out a little bit when you have more transportation options, more you know, options for people to walk to shops and entertainment. And so I think from the county's perspective, or from my perspective within the county, caveat, a lot of these things are my perspective, so, as a county employee. But I think that I think a lot of the steps towards affordability are reinvestment, because we have a lot of communities that have very nice housing stock that could be comparable to a Swarthmore or a media, places that I'm a media resident, places that we love, but that are not, they have higher taxes or older infrastructure or less desirable school districts. And so they're not absorbing the portion of the market that maybe could help to make the housing prices more affordable across the board if people had more choices to select. You know, what a boon it would be if the entire city of Chester had lovely and diverse housing stock rather than, you know, vacant land. So I think from our perspective on the county, we kind of look at affordability as a component of the sort of rising tide lifting all boats sort of philosophy, and that the more of our communities we can make as appealing as, you know, some of the places, and I think I do see the trend that there is this desirability to be in a walkable community. And so rather than shoehorning $1 million houses into media, as is happening, you can have just a diversity of housing throughout for a variety of populations. And not that no one is ever gonna not want to select a suburban house, but just sort of trying to kind of raise the appeal of these older communities or of already developed areas. Like Delaware County is always competing with Chester County in that we don't have as much developable space just in general. So I think we're big proponents of that we can provide a lot of options. It's just a matter of kind of getting a little reinvestment in there.
So the problem with going last is I don't have much original to offer, but I agree with everything that's been said. Really appreciate Joe's point about kind of the issue, and I really think this is important for municipalities to understand, of the issue not necessarily being at the municipal level and a blame game at the municipal level. This is a national issue, this is a regional issue. Incomes are too low relative to the cost of housing. I am stepping away from Kennett Collaborative, where I've been employed, to be a kind of wannabe developer. So I've proposed a few projects in Kennett Square. So I've really been digging into what is the cost per square foot to construct in our market in Kennett Square, which, you know, would be the same here. And it's high. I mean, you're looking at probably for, you know, decent construction quality, you're looking at closer to 210 a square foot, maybe even 220. You know, you get a broad range there. And so, you know, housing is expensive. To answer the question, I tend to, as I talk about affordable housing, and this isn't necessarily the right way to do it, but my vernacular is affordable housing as subsidized housing, and then attainable housing as this increasingly missing portion of housing for middle income folks that is increasingly difficult to find. You know, I think there's a few things to touch on that, especially that latter point of this attainable housing. It's allowing for a diversity of typologies, different housing types, whether it's smaller square foot units, whether it's the 500 square foot unit, you know, the 1500 square foot unit, allowing for diversity there, I think is extremely important because of just the cost per square foot. You also have a lot of changes in, you know, family structure. We no longer have the nuclear family that we had 50 years ago. That has changed a lot. You know, in Kennett Square, we are 50% Latino, and a lot of our Latino population lives in very, very, very substandard housing conditions of, 1,800 square feet with 5 families living in there, they would kill for 600 square feet for their family with a front door. Same thing with a lot of millennials. They are not looking for, the 3,000 square foot house. They're looking for 800 square feet or something more attainable. So I think that's a huge, huge factor. They all brought notes. I'm trying to do this off my phone. I'm prepared. I think it's important also to talk about, the cost of housing up front, as well as the cost for, cash flow of housing. How do you actually pay for this? And that gets into a lot of other conversations. I think, as was mentioned, cost of, having 2 cars is a huge factor there. Is that 10 to 15% of someone's income? It can be. So that's super high. This is where we get into conversations about ADUs, accessory dwelling units, in order to offset some of that cost of living. That's extremely important to talk about. And I think just to kind of wrap up, bookend this, Joe talked about at the macro level, 30,000 feet. It is also, it requires getting an understanding in your local market, what do people need? I have no clue what that looks like here in Swarthmore. And Kennett's where I have a really good feel for what that looks like from just spending a lot of time with people. I know what it looks like for a lot of the Latino population. I know what it looks like for our essential workers who also can't afford to live in Kennett Square, our teachers, our nurses, all of that. So it's having a good feel on the ground for what that looks like and addressing those needs as they come up.
Thank you all for those really thoughtful answers, and in a way it's a little bit validating, I think, as listening to your really complex thoughts on this, because we've often been asked as a task force, like, well, what does affordable housing mean? And as a group, we've kind of been struggling to wrap our head around what that answer is in general and what that answer is for Swarthmore. So it's a little bit relief that like maybe there isn't quite a pat answer that we can come up with, but really taking all of these factors that you've mentioned into consideration and thinking as a community, where along this spectrum we want to focus and where will make a difference for us. So before we get to Q&A, we did ask each of you to talk a little bit more about the area of expertise that you bring to bear. Joe, I know you mentioned that you were kind of thinking about the 30,000 foot level. So we'll come back to you and thinking about how that informs our discussion moving forward. But Rob, if you can pull up the slide presentations, then I'm going to pass it back to Patricia here. Tell us a little bit more.
So I'm going to talk about exclusionary zoning and the affirmatively furthering fair housing mandate. I'm going to hold this so you can hear me. So you can go to the next slide. And so just a very, very kind of high level, quick definition of exclusionary zoning without going and talking about like a century worth of history. But exclusionary zoning is the state and local ordinances prohibiting the sale or rental of homes to non-white buyers or renters in white areas or to white buyers in non-white areas. So we're kind of talking about the inception of exclusionary zoning here. And that was typically enforced through municipal code. So explicitly racial zoning was practiced during the 1900s until 1917. That's when there was a Supreme Court decision that overturned that discriminatory behavior. But that was still practiced until about 1950s because it wasn't enforced, right? So we're talking about 50 years of explicit zoning ordinances that prohibited integration. And so what the Supreme Court found was that zoning restrictions based on race were a limitation on property rights and outlawed the practice of racial zoning for that reason. And so what happened and what we saw after 1917 was that economic zoning arose as a pretext for racial zoning. And so in 1921, a model zoning ordinance was distributed by the Department of Commerce that encouraged all municipalities to adopt zoning ordinances that segregated housing by economic factors. And so that accomplished a lot of racially, segregated communities and accomplishing kind of these racially homogenous neighborhoods that we see today. And zoning ordinances with the effect of economic segregation still have historically proven legally sustainable despite disparate impact based on race. And so we have some examples of what the exclusionary zoning looks like, and that can be minimum lot size requirements, single residence per lot requirements, or costly building codes. And really what these do is they work together and make it difficult to build multi-family rental units that would allow lower income residents to live in wealthy suburban developments. And that keeps people out of reach for schools, quality education, employment, and large lot size requirements reduce the supply of available land and drive up housing costs and can further keep out low-income residents. And so some of the consequences is that it promotes racial segregation and it creates concentrated poverty and also concentrated wealth. And so just talking about concentrated poverty, the number of people living in areas of concentrated poverty has doubled. This is since 2000, but there's also research that shows like from 1970 to 1990, it doubled. Then, it's doubled since 2000. Poverty has become more concentrated, and more than 1 in 4 Black poor people and nearly 1 in 6 Hispanic people live in neighborhoods of extreme poverty, compared to 1 in 13 of the white poor. And I just want to give a quick statistic that's relevant. According to the American Community Survey data, the city of Chester is what we call like a recap. It's an area of racial and economic segregation with poverty rate that is 3 times higher than the region as a whole, and population that is over 70% African American and 12% Hispanic, and that's compared to the 21% and 9% respectively region-wide, right? And so we know that Chester is, we see a lot of this kind of research manifesting in this area. The next slide. And I just wanted to share this quote by Paul Gyourko, who's a PhD, a professor at Rutgers. He said, "These neighborhoods are not the value-free outcome of the impartial workings of the housing market. Rather, in large measure, they are the inevitable and predictable consequences of deliberate policy choices." And if you haven't read The Color of Law, I think Richard Rothstein also does a really great job of kind of outlining how policy play a role in the segregated communities in which we live. So I'm going to talk pretty quickly about affirmatively furthering fair housing. And so the Fair Housing Act was signed on April 11th of 1968, and from its inception, the Fair Housing Act not only prohibited discrimination in housing-related activities and transactions, but also imposed a duty on the federal government to affirmatively further fair housing. And so because in practice HUD programs have historically perpetuated patterns of racial and economic segregation, the affirmatively furthering fair housing provision seeks to begin to remedy the impact of that historical segregation. And so what we know is that the United States housing policies have historically, again, created and perpetuated segregated housing practices. We're all familiar with redlining. We've seen a lot of redlining maps, I feel like, especially recently, and we know that that was one of the policies that was carried out by the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which was a New Deal initiative that was established in 1933. And so the AFFH provision, the obligation covers all activities, policies, and procedures of recipients and subrecipients of federal housing funding, including the Community Development Block Grant, entitlement jurisdictions, and public housing authorities. And these entities are responsible to hold staff and subrecipients accountable for complying with fair housing requirements in all of their projects and activities. And so under the AFFH mandate, HUD and the participants need to determine who lacks access to opportunity and address any inequity among the protected class groups, promote integration and reduce segregation, and transform racially or ethnically concentrated areas of poverty into areas of opportunity. And program participants, and just to kind of close it out, program participants certify that they take meaningful actions that taken together address significant disparities in housing needs and in access to opportunity, replacing segregated living patterns with truly integrated and balanced living patterns, transforming racially or ethnically concentrated areas of poverty into areas of opportunity, and fostering and maintaining compliance with civil rights and fair housing law. And so that was very quick, and it was a lot of information, and so I'm excited to kind of talk more about that.
So one thing before we move on to you, Rebecca, is that it's really interesting to hear about how some of these ideas are now being affirmatively baked into policy from the federal level. I think one of the things for us as a community to think about is what do some of these same trends mean, even when they're not necessarily codified in federal housing policy? Because many of us know that, you know, certainly Swarthmore has had its own share of historical exclusion in housing throughout our history, and even thinking about how the historically Black neighborhood of Swarthmore has changed over time, and what are the patterns underlying that, and acknowledging that, you know, while affordability may be one factor in thinking about equity, it's certainly not the key to fixing all of those issues. So just thinking about that complex landscape and what that means for us. Maybe we can get into some more inclusionary housing ideas as we get into our discussion. Okay, Rebecca, I'm going to pass it to you.
Thank you. And as my presentation comes up. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you a little bit specifically about affordable housing as it relates to, as Gayatri mentioned, the 2020 adopted housing component of the Delaware County 2035 Delaware County's comprehensive plan. So first, a little bit about kind of that context. This is to Joe's point earlier about all the local control of land use. This is what's to blame in Pennsylvania, or what accounts for it in Pennsylvania. A piece of legislation called the Pennsylvania Municipalities Planning Code, or MPC, is what kind of mandates or prescribes a lot of what we do at the county. And so as far as planning tools, it has descriptions of how the comprehensive planning development process should happen. It mandates comprehensive plans at both the local and the county level. And so we recently developed our comprehensive plan to meet that mandate. Comprehensive plans are generally pretty community-based. They're supposed to involve a lot of consensus building and provide a long-term vision, but they are not something that is legally enforceable. That comes into play with zoning ordinances, as well as subdivision and land development ordinances, which are passed by local municipalities. There's no county-wide zoning. Zoning in particular is usually the best way to implement the goals of a comprehensive plan. That's sort of your way to create requirements for residents and developers to adhere to a specific sort of pattern of development that is what the community desires. They are controlled locally, as I said, although there is an MPC mandated requirement for the county's planning commission to review any development proposals that come through any of the municipalities. The outcome of those reviews is advisory only, and so it goes back to the municipal planning commissions and councils or boards of supervisors or what have you, and then the ultimate decision rests with them. Occasionally we do some other plans and studies that are specific to specific issues. So within Delaware County, as I mentioned, we have a developed comprehensive plan that started back in 2013 when we adopted a land use framework plan. These are elements that are required by the MPC to be contained within comprehensive plans. So we ended up doing ours as a pretty in-depth series of plans on different subjects. and I'm gonna focus most on the most recently adopted one, the housing plan, which we finished and adopted very excitingly through a largely virtual process during the first year of the pandemic. That was a fun learning experience. All right, so next, just a little bit of what's within this plan. We did have, it was a cooperative project between my department, the Department of Planning, and the Office of Housing and Community Development, which is a separate office, and which office is most focused on federally funded, affordable, affordable in the sense that Bo mentioned, subsidized or federally supported or grant supported housing for the lowest incomes. But since they always have to do a lot of reporting and a lot of analysis for the grants and projects that they do, they had a really good understanding of some of the issues of some of the poorest populations within Delaware County. And although we didn't want this to be an only affordable housing plan, we wanted it to take into account some of the broader market trends as well. It was important for us to make sure that it was cooperative between the two departments. And then we did have a housing task force with membership from some private developers, some municipal representatives, including Jane Billings, the former manager here in Swarthmore, Rachel Wentworth, who is Patricia's boss at the Housing Equality Center. And so we had a pretty diverse set of stakeholders giving us input and guidance. The three-part goal that we came up with for the comp plan element for housing was to enrich the supply and variety of quality housing, to provide for and anticipate future housing needs of residents of all ages, abilities, and incomes, and to collaborate across organizations to accomplish all these common goals. So a couple of the emerging trends that we examined a little bit as part of the comprehensive plan while we were doing our background research. We have seen a little bit of shift, and some of this was pre-pandemic, and it might have been done a little bit. But for a while there was a trend that there was quite a bit of movement of populations back into what we call central places, which is your downtowns, your cities, your more urbanized, already built up, developed areas, rather than that was a little bit of a reversal of kind of the continual outward spread that had been the trend over the past several decades. Missing middle is a concept that I think we've touched on, a couple other folks touched on in their intro, which essentially says that the market there in urban areas, you get a lot of high-rise, very dense apartment development, and then everything else that's being built is large single-family homes or for larger families, and there's not a lot that sort of fits that middle of the road. It's a little denser, but not super high density. It can fit in a variety of contexts and locations and neighborhoods. And that's what's not getting built, perhaps because of some of the market reasons that Joe mentioned, where developers are looking to maximize profit. But that's an ongoing crisis, and that's a big part of what could, be, if it's addressed, what could help to support a better housing market. The millennials and boomers are driving housing demands with different types of demands and desires for, as Bo referenced, like not necessarily buying housing right off the bat. Some boomers are looking to downsize or to move around. So ironically, the two sort of populations that are often pitted against each other have a lot of commonalities and desires when it comes to housing, especially in terms of those, sort of desiring mobility, lower costs, flexibility, maybe smaller space, maybe more unique or cooperative space. An increase in the rental market has been happening, at least across the region, whether or not it's because of income levels or whether or not it's just because of lifestyle choices. A lot of our municipalities were, used to panicking when they saw, rental market going up, like that was a sign that their communities were, in trouble or losing a housing base. But, it's really a trend all over the place, is that's just a more and more selected option. And then age-targeted development being a very popular option with the general aging of the American population, as well as it being a popular choice for developers and communities because it brings in tax base without necessarily bringing in school-age children. And so that was something we saw that, was happening around the country. So we did a lot of census analysis, as I mentioned. We do like the census data. Just a few things about Delaware County in general, comparing us to the surrounding municipalities. Our housing is older, it's smaller, it's more mixed in terms of the diversity of single family, detached or attached. We got a lot of twins or grow homes and multifamily housing. Chester County, Montgomery County, although parts of them have that, there's a lot of more open space where, whereas we're a little bit more developed and developed a lot earlier as sort of a first generation suburb than some of those areas. And within Delaware County, we do know that there are a lot of geographic discrepancies. The areas to the east and to the south are not the same as the areas to the north and to the west. So we've seen some areas gain a lot of housing units and some areas lose. Some areas that are heavily homeowner, some that are heavily renter occupied, some that are much newer, some that are much older in terms of average housing age, some that have mostly single family, some that have mostly multifamily. Where vacancies are concentrated, and then of course the location of where affordable housing is located. A few more interesting statistics or things that we found. Household size has increased, particularly among renter occupied households, although we have, from a national trend perspective, household sizes are decreasing. But we have this increase of, I guess, while some household sizes are increasing, then a larger portion of the population is people who are living alone, opting to live alone, whether that's young, old, across the board. It is, it's nearly a third. Others have talked about this since 1980. Housing costs and rent have increased at a much greater rate than household income. This is a national trend. And that affordability issues, specifically measuring against that 30% of income, disproportionately affect people who are renters. And again, the rental costs are what have really skyrocketed. So based on our research, our input from our task force, we came up with this 5-objective structure for our plan that has to do with creating diverse and attractive neighborhoods. That touches a little bit on what I mentioned in my sort of opening, that we want to make sure that it's not, that places are desirable places to move with character and with lots of offerings, and not just a sea of housing, perhaps, as is sometimes the case. That we have a diversity of housing types, that we have quality housing stock, that is to say, making sure both older housing that may be decaying and newer housing, as there were some cases where building codes weren't upheld and newer housing stock was built in a rushed way that cost people a lot of money. As well as a range of housing opportunities for all ages, abilities, and income levels. And then also to, for our own purposes, really look at ways that we could collect data and measure and track some of these things that we want to make sure that in the long term, we can say this is improved or that has changed, and see if we can move the needle on any of this. So then just really quick, and kind of from what's a few tools that, some of which are mentioned within the housing plan, but generally, people may know about. I see them on this wheel of housing opportunities back here. A couple things like form-based zoning, missing middle housing that I mentioned, adaptive reuse of older buildings, inclusionary zoning, accessory dwelling units, and cooperative housing. I'll go through these pretty quickly. But first up, on the next slide, sorry. Form-based zoning, for those of you that don't know, media is recently has not adopted, but underwent a process to adopt what's called form-based zoning, where Patricia mentioned all the reasons that zoning is the main tool we have for sort of land use control, even though it has this long legacy of exclusion and separation and pretty much got us where we are now. Form-based zoning is a little bit more of a code where you can kind of prescribe how you want generally the form of the properties, and you leave use to be a little bit more form determined, so that it doesn't matter if someone, if you build a sort of street style, downtown street style building, then that's most likely to attract businesses on the bottom and maybe offices or housing above, versus saying this is only for, housing. And this transect model shows the range from, your open space to then your more urban development style. So it's a pretty well accepted in planning areas as a good tool and helpful. Sometimes it can be helpful in older places like Swarthmore to try to codify what existed, back in the days that maybe were before extensive zoning regulations, and try to get more of that. And it can also be helpful in new areas where, you want to build more of a traditional style. All right, next is that missing middle concept. As I mentioned, it would be small footprint buildings, and it might have a lower perceived density. So this is the kind of thing where a fourplex or maybe a small bungalow court could fit within an existing single family neighborhood without a lot of disruption, and thereby just create additional units within an area, but not sort of disrupt the neighborhood feel. So this is it's a really interesting, they've got some great graphics of a lot of places in the West have started developing some of these sample types, and they're really interesting to look at, and I encourage you all to look up some of the, look up missing middle and the Opticos firm that kind of originated the term. And then adaptive reuse, you have a lot of historic character here, and a couple of communities that I know throughout the region have started making the reuse of buildings something that you can provide a zoning incentive for, such that then encourages people to, maybe it allows commercial, maybe it allows the subdivision of a property, maybe it allows sort of an additional unit on the property above what's allowed. And so that could be a way to encourage a little bit more. Then inclusionary zoning is a little bit more of an active approach. This is a bit of a buzzword. Philadelphia has tried it. Communities have done it mandated, where a development, as a component of getting approved, development is required to, in some cases, or is given the option to, with certain bonuses like increased density or increased building height, if they set aside a certain number of units within a market rate residential development project for subsidized for lower income housing properties. This is kind of newer. It can be seen as kind of extreme, but it is one of the options out there. Next up, accessory dwelling units and or cooperative housing. That's sort of non-traditional. This is something that Swarthmore did recently craft ordinances on. Whether or not those ordinances, so those will be something interesting to watch to see whether they do bear the fruit that they were hoping to or have the intended effects. And then, let's see, there's a few other programs. This is where our housing, Office of Housing and Community Development has more expertise of rehabilitation assistance for homeowners with fixed income so that they can stay in their house. There are some first-time homebuyer programs, but it's possible for a municipality to kind of have a fund or set aside, make it a priority to fund its own first-time homebuyer program, because I think a lot of the federal programs are very stringent as far as like the size and price of the house and the income qualifications of the home buyer. But encouraging new entries to the home buyer market could be a way to help people get that leg onto the housing ladder. And then Housing Development Fund to start to fund a project that either maybe through fees from development, fee in lieu of including affordable development in a project, to start to build a fund that then enables a private or a nonprofit group to start to build affordable targeted housing. So that's pretty much it. You guys are already have convened your group of stakeholders and starting to create a vision, so I applaud you for that. And hopefully what you produce will be something that will help you take action in a positive way. I just mentioned Phoenixville also did a similar type of thing back in, I think, around 2018. So they're a good reference and have had some luck at developing projects there. And also because Phoenixville was undergoing a significant revitalization, they were also trying to offset some gentrification that was happening as projects were getting redeveloped. That's all I have. That was a lot. Yep.
If it's okay, I'm gonna stand and just point. And sorry about my voice. I woke up this morning and didn't have a voice, so voice cracks or anything, don't laugh. So I'm gonna just talk about three things real quick. First point, is this still used as a church? Yes, so I got my 3-point sermon here. So we've got Swarthmore needs more housing, design matters, and control what you can control. So next slide. So I want to make 2 points on kind of Swarthmore needs more housing. Sorry, I'm in the way for these folks. And I didn't include the wrong picture here. I included Kennett because it's easier to talk about where you're from than the community you're going to, and critique the community that you don't really know that well. But this is Kennett Square. So Kennett is 1 square mile. We have a population of about 6,000. If you go, and I know this is true here, it's true in a lot of communities, if you go to our borough council, you will likely hear someone say that we are full, we can't let anyone else in, we have no more land, we're done. Anyone know where this is? It's small, you probably can't see it. This is Savannah, Georgia. This is the core historic district of Savannah. It's about 2 square miles. The population is about 20,000. It's actually higher than that. It's probably closer to about 35,000 any given time. Most of it is vacation rentals because Savannah's, I think, the best place to go for a bachelorette party. I'm not making that up. That's the rule. But the point is, Kennett could increase 50% in our population and still provide housing for people. Savannah has infinite amounts of attainable housing, by that historic district of different, this missing middle housing that we're talking about, just going back to the fourplex, the duplex, the row home that's split up, they've got a lot of that. So my point is, we can provide more housing opportunities. We have room to grow, and we can do it in ways that make the community even more beautiful. Savannah's just an amazing place. The second reason I think Swarthmore and other communities need more housing is because I spent Strong Towns was mentioned, so I spent about 5 years working for an organization called Strong Towns and with a group called Urban 3, whose this data is from. We help municipalities that were struggling with their financial insolvency. And most communities across the country are struggling with financial struggles. I imagine Swarthmore is, as a municipality, this is a huge benefit, but does anyone know off the top of their head, is it 40-50% of the land mass for the college?
About 30.
30. So 30% of your land mass is essentially non-taxable. That means the rest of your land, and that is great. I mean, that is a huge benefit, but that means the rest of your tax base has to cover and subsidize that. Do understand that. Other communities deal with this. You know, in Westchester, they have a university. They're also the county hub. So they have a significant portion of their buildings that are non-taxable. They struggle financially in huge ways to maintain their sewer, their streets, all of that stuff because of that. This is just, I'll just show you some real quick, some data that we would do. This is the type of work we would do. This is Lafayette, Louisiana. This is essentially, each of these lines is a parcel in this municipality. Think of this as profit and think of this as loss. So we would go to each parcel and we'd say, how much is it contributing in tax revenue and what does it cost to maintain that parcel? Literally, the feet of pipe in front of the house, is it 50 feet, is it 30 feet, is it 75? The width of the road, is it an 18-foot road, is it a 25-foot road? We would do all of this. How many pump stations, when someone flushes a toilet, how many pump stations does that go through before it reaches the wastewater facility? We do all that work, and this is kind of the stuff we do. Next slide. This just puts it in kind of a 3D map to kind of show, okay, these are the parts of the city that contribute more, and this is where a lot of your loss is. I'll go to the next slide. Is anyone red, green, colorblind? In a room like this, so this is Lafayette, Louisiana still. This is their core downtown. It's not a super nice, trendy downtown. They're making a lot of progress. Some of the second story units are being filled up with residential. They still have some missing ground floor. They would kill for a kind of quaint downtown like Swarthmore House, but they're trying. But what you're seeing here is, so the green here is net positive. So the green is the parts of the community that are contributing more in tax revenue than it costs to maintain them. The red is net loss, the parts of the city that are costing more to maintain and service than they contribute in tax revenue. The higher the spike, the greater the net profit or loss. This is the core downtown in Lafayette. Really, really profitable. Again, they have a long way to go, but super profitable. This is their kind of regional shopping mall out here. Huge net loss for them. When you actually look at a taxable value per acre, when you look at how much it costs to maintain the asphalt, the pipes that are going out there, the sewage that's required to meet that, huge loss for them. This is out here is what we call the 3-car garage with the attached house. It's mostly what's out there. What's interesting is this right here is their poor neighborhoods in Lafayette. These are the parts of the city that when we were going to do this analysis, they said, don't stay in these neighborhoods. That's where the burglaries happen. You don't want to be in those neighborhoods. These neighborhoods are profitable. A lot of these neighborhoods out on the edge are losing money. In some ways, and we'll get into this in a future slide, these poor neighborhoods are subsidizing the wealthy neighborhoods here. So as you look at providing more housing, what's the point of this? You need more housing because you have a tax base, you have an obligation, you have roads that you have to maintain, you have sewers, you have fire hydrants you have to maintain, you have a police force, you have all of these costs and these are just going up. You need a tax base to maintain those. And in some ways, this will sound like a contradictory statement. You need wealth here and to be able to maintain that. You need wealthy people living here to be able to maintain that when you have 30% of your land dedicated to university. That is just the reality. That's just part of the truth. You need the EIT and you need the high property values. But on the flip side, the other truth is that you can allow attainable, affordable, small footprint, 4plexes, 6plexes, all of these missing middle housing typologies, and they'll still be profitable for you. They may even be more profitable than some of the large single family homes. you can build a fourplex and it's gonna help your tax base. Next slide. Here's just you can go ahead and press the next one. This is Lafayette. This is the easiest way to break down why municipalities are struggling. I'll just go through this quickly. In 1949, Lafayette had a population of 33,500. In 2015, their population grew 3.5 times to 121,000. So their wealth grew by 3.5 times. But their obligations, in 1949, they had 5 feet of pipe per person. That grew to 2015 to 50 feet of pipe per person. You can see the same in fire hydrants. So if you're looking at this just pure math, their income grew 3.5 times and their obligations grew 10 times and 21 times. Financially, you can't do that. This is because Lafayette, like many kind of southern cities and a lot of cities outside of the Northeast, have the ability to annex land around them and expand, and that's created a lot of struggles for them. It provided near-term wealth for them, but long-term liabilities they can't afford to maintain. Pennsylvania, we've been in some ways cursed, but I think long-term blessed by the inability to annex a lot of the land around us, because it's prevented us from making this mistake. Understand, when they realize this, what do? They go and annex the next plot of land, and it becomes a Ponzi scheme. This is every municipality in those places. They finally realized that they were playing a Ponzi scheme. They were using new annexed land, new tax base to subsidize their existing liabilities. Next slide. Here's just a few examples from Kennett. So this is kind of some row homes close to our downtown. Next slide. Sorry, I have this on a bunch of slides. So population, or the value per acre of this is just over $1 million. Next slide. Here's a McMansion kind of out on the edge in Kennett. Next slide. So we go from $1 million per acre to 400,000 per acre. Next slide. Next slide. These are newly built townhomes in Kennett. These are not necessarily affordable, but newly built townhomes, they have a value of about 4.4 million per acre. Next slide. McMansion out on the edge. I found this one because it was for sale for like 4.5 million. Next slide. 200,000 an acre. And understand there's some unfairness here. This probably has a septic and it probably has well water where it's at, but still understand as these hookups happen, municipalities have costs that they have to maintain. So as you grow, you need to think about how to produce enough tax revenue to cover your ongoing maintenance. The good thing is affordable housing, attainable housing can contribute to that in huge ways. Next slide. So 2 other points I'm just going to make. Design matters. Next slide. This is Warren Place Mews, built in 1878 as affordable, attainable housing at the time, workforce housing at the time. Stunningly beautiful. Like we know how to do this. Next slide. I'm just going to show a few examples of this. This is one of my favorite projects. It's in Portland. It's called Jolene's First Cousin. 13 affordable homes and 3 small shops on a single family lot. It's previously a single family lot. This is what you can do. This is that missing middle housing. Beautiful, dense. I think this is a bookstore. Just a lovable project. And my point in saying design matters is the biggest challenge to building new housing. I think Joe kind of touched on this. Is we have, especially in Pennsylvania, we have small municipalities that make the decisions about housing. When you hear development is happening across the street from you, what is your gut reaction? Oh crap. Like it absolutely is, because we have, frankly, 50 or 60 years of bad development practices, such that when you hear new development, you think it's going to be worse than what's there before. So a guy named Andres Duani, who kind of mentored a lot of the Opticos folks, he made a point once to me, and he said, 200 years ago, people used to hope that their city burned down because they knew that what was going to be built afterwards. He's kind of tongue-in-cheek, he's Cuban, but he said what they knew what would come after would be better than what was there before. We have lost that confidence entirely. So in order to get that back, and in order to allow for more housing to be built, we need to design matters. We need to build good stuff. Next slide. Just a few more. This is a 55-unit affordable housing in Santa Barbara. affordable housing can look beautiful, it can fit into the neighborhood. It doesn't have to look that much different than market rate housing. You know, our surrounding has a profound impact on us, so we should be building in ways that are dignified for the people that are living there. Next slide. It's my favorite architect. If you get a chance to look him up, his name's Peter Barber. He's in London. He's designed a dozen or more affordable housing projects. This is actually for homeless folks in London, just like I would love to live there. It's artistic, it's fun, it's beautiful, it's charming. This is also an affordable housing complex that he has. You know, the dignity of a front door and a garden where someone can step out on. That's not, you know, we need housing. We're in a crisis mode. We need to provide new housing, but design does matter as we think about how to do that. Next slide. Last point, control what you can control. Next slide. So we've touched on this a number of times in the kind of previous comments. You know, you have Swarthmore. You can't control what happens in the region. Your prices are to some extent dictated by the supply of housing and other things going on at the regional level. Guess what? You have zero control over that. I mean, maybe a little bit of control, you know, call your congressman, all of that kind of stuff, but like relatively you have little control over that. You have zero control over what happens here as a small municipality. Next slide. So what can you control? You cannot control the cost of lumber, the cost of 2x4s. This is that, you know, does it cost $200 per square foot to build? You can't control that. Like, you can't. I mean, you can figure out ways around building codes, you can figure out ways around different styles, but like 2x4s, electrical conduit, you have no control over what that costs. Interest rates, anyone here have control of interest rates? No control whatsoever. You know, when interest rates were down, the housing prices rose, we had no control over that. Development surrounding townships, you have no control over that, maybe, but I can tell you in Kennett Borough, we have zero control over the surrounding townships at all, what they're doing. Regional development, national housing narrative, this kind of, you know, frenzy to buy houses, we have no control over that. But what can we control? We've brought up several of these things here. Zoning, the number of new units to some extent, the unit sizes, that kind of missing middle housing. Accessory dwelling units, it's encouraging to see some kind of progress on that, allowing those, these kinds of things around the edges. Height of buildings, don't know what the conversation is, but you know, that is something you can control. And the local housing narrative. And by that I mean, when someone comes forward and says, I want to do an attainable or affordable housing complex, you can control with your friends and neighbors the support for that project. That's the local housing narrative. The project will be shot down by folks who come and say, we're full, we can't allow any more people. You can control that. So focus on what you can control and not what you can't control. Because a lot of times I see municipalities start to blame, like, who's at fault for, you know, it's our fault, it's previous whoever, or it's this building official or that developer, it's their fault. A lot of this is not, and if you kind of break down a pro forma of the development, a lot of it you can't control, but focus on what you can control, and there's empowerment there. Thank you.
Thank you all for presenting such a diversity of viewpoints on this issue. I want to ask sort of one kind of level-setting question as we think about what our process is moving forward, and then I'm going to turn it over to the audience for questions. And you know, a couple of you touched on this in different ways in thinking about the fact that moving the needle on affordability can be a challenging process for a number of different reasons. And so, you know, in your experience, when we think about communities that have started to move the needle, what's been the tipping point? And you know, how long does this process take? You know, as we think about what lies ahead for us, you know, should we expect to kind of move forward in small bits? Is there something big that we can do that changes the conversation? And Joe, maybe I'll throw this question to you first because it kind of falls into that last point you made about things that you can control.
I don't know that many municipalities doing this, you know, extremely well. This is a challenge. My short answer would be municipalities that have made progress on affordable housing, attainable housing, and other things have community support. I think that's like the missing ingredient. I can't tell you how many task forces, whatever I've sat on in Kennett Square, forces that I just, I sit in a meeting and I'm like, who tasked this force? No one, like, we have a dozen affordable housing kind of task force. A lot of the answers for how to do this, it's not rocket science. I mean, it's like everything that was just presented, that is a lot of what you'll hear nationally in any conversation. So how do you go from kind of not knowing the answers, but knowing what needs to be done, kind of feeling your way through the dark? It's community support. It's a lot of people showing up to say, we need to do this. It's figuring out, financing mechanisms. There are developers out there, like that's not the problem. It's figuring out how to get community support for stuff.
I'll just add that a few places that I've seen, I think sometimes does need to be some leadership taken. I mean, you guys all have a good task force, but the formation of dedicated nonprofits has yielded some success in some places. I'm thinking of land banking being a tool that can be used and developed. It's more often, I know Pittsburgh is doing some of that with some of their vacant lots, and then leading to redevelopment, because you can do more complex types of projects where you have sort of affordable to market rate housing that you can construct that allows people to come in and build equity and then sell their house, but still allows you to control some of the, price aspects. But that usually tends to be a very management heavy type of approach. And so it does involve, formation of new groups and organizations that can coordinate with the developers, as Bo mentioned, that there are developers, and then as Joe mentioned, the need for obtaining financing to supplement that and to show for local government to demonstrate commitment to it, and to think it worthwhile enough to actually invest in making it happen where the market won't support it or doesn't, naturally kind of make it easy.
Yeah, I think I'm going to echo a lot of what has already been said. I think in communities where I've seen some progress, I think it's like just nationally, again, like everyone's talked about it, a very difficult issue, is there is a kind of value setting within the community, that the community comes forth and says, this is what's important to us, and we're going to, do the research that we need to do. We're going to invest in ways to make sure that we can, support the community. And whether that's through, I know we talked about inclusionary zoning, and like New Jersey has the Mount Laurel Doctrine, source of income protection that we see in Philadelphia, right? From the fair housing perspective, we know that when there is source of income protection, that people are able to access housing that they are qualified for. So I think, but just largely, I think that from what I've seen, communities that say that this is a priority to us, that we're interested in economic diversity, we're interested in racial integration, these are our values and this is what we want to do. I think those communities have been successful in some ways.
I actually do have a couple of comments from the nerdy academic on this. My first answer, are we going to see big jumps or small steps? Small steps, and that's fine. The point made that Swarthmore will not influence market prices in this region. We're too small. But that should not stop us from doing what we think are sensible things. Market prices will be affected if we do it right, and it's good, and people copy you. And then you can reach a scale where you start having market effects. I think the only way to see big, discrete changes would be if a higher level of government intervened. And think about for those of you who don't study the issue, as this is a hot button issue all through California. And for the last 2 years, there have actually been legislative attempts, which failed, but legislative attempts to to limit individual jurisdictions' ability to stop development. They failed, but it used to be you were dead politically if you even brought it up in the state legislature in Sacramento. Now you can bring it up, and the individual who did actually got reelected to the state senate, so he didn't die politically, right? So that's one thing. The other thing I would recommend to the task force is to involve the business community. One, they're powerful, they have a lot of money, and they care about affordable housing. Because if housing's not affordable, they have to pay higher wages. And if they work in a competitive industry, they can't pay higher wages and earn a rate of return they want to on their firm. So the business community, I think, is a really untapped resource in this. They have strong incentives to want affordable housing.
All right, thank you. So at this point, I'd like to open it up to questions from the audience.